I was standing in line at the Tim Hortons on King Street when I saw my husband through the window. He was across the street in front of the Fairmont, his hand resting on the small of an older woman's back. She was maybe 60, wearing a camel coat and heels that were too high for the November slush. He was leaning down to say something to her, and she laughed. That kind of laugh where you throw your head back and touch the other person's arm. My double-double sat on the counter and went cold. I had been with my husband for 7 years. I knew every version of him. The way he holds a door. The way he laughs too loud at his own jokes. The way he touches the back of his neck when he's uncomfortable. He was not uncomfortable now. He was relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. I smiled at the teenager behind the counter, picked up my cup, and walked out. I did not cross the street. I did not call his name. I turned right and walked 3 blocks to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the parking garage wall until my breathing slowed. My name is Cecily. I'm 31. My husband, who I'll just call my husband because that's all he is now, works in commercial real estate development. We live in a semi-detached in Leslieville. We have a rescue dog named Biscuit. And a mortgage that keeps me up some nights. We'd been married 4 years when I saw him standing in front of that hotel with his hand on that woman's back. The drive home from downtown Toronto takes 25 minutes without traffic. That day it took 40. I used every single one of those minutes talking myself out of what I'd just seen. He has clients. Older clients. Of course he touches people's backs. He's in sales. That's what those people do. The hotel is near his office. She could be anyone. She could be a colleague's mother. She could be a potential buyer. She could be absolutely nothing. I had the pot on and the dog fed by the time he got home at 7. How was your day? Fine, he said. Busy. Had a client dinner that ran long. He kissed me on the cheek and went to change. A client dinner. Not a client meeting outside the Fairmont at 5 in the afternoon in November. A dinner. Already the story had a shape that didn't fit what I'd seen, and he didn't even know I'd seen. He didn't even know I'd seen it. I served the pasta and said nothing. That was in November. What followed were 3 months of small things that individually meant nothing, and collectively meant everything. He started going to the gym before work, which he'd never done before. He got a haircut without telling me. A new jacket appeared in the closet. Dark gray wool. The kind of thing he never would have picked out himself. Because I'd always bought his clothes and I knew his taste, he started taking longer showers. He took his phone into the bathroom. In January, I found a receipt in his coat pocket. Not a hotel receipt, not a restaurant. A receipt from a jeweler on Bloor Street, $4,300. The item description just said custom. I took a photo and put it back. That night, his mother called. She talked to me for 20 minutes while he was in the other room, and at some point she said, "He seems distracted lately. Is everything okay with the two of you?" I told her everything was fine. I don't know exactly when I stopped believing my own reassurances, but by February I'd stopped. I work as a project coordinator for an architectural firm. We had a site visit that got canceled on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and instead of going back to the office, I drove to the block near his building and waited. I don't know what I was looking for. I told myself I was just thinking. I sat in my car and thought. He came out at 4:30. He wasn't alone. She was with him, the same woman from November, same camel coat, different scarf. They walked together down the street, not touching this time, but close. That specific kind of close where two people have agreed not to touch, but their bodies haven't quite gotten the message. 2 blocks from his office. I watched from across the street until they came out, 40 minutes later. He put her in a cab. He watched the cab drive away. Then he stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets before going back toward his office. I sat in my car until I couldn't feel my feet. I went home. I made dinner. He got home at 7 again and said he'd been in meetings all afternoon. I looked at him across the kitchen tables and I thought, I have been sleeping next to a stranger. That weekend, his sister came for brunch. She's 10 years older than him and she's always been direct with me in a way that I've never been sure whether to appreciate. After he went to walk Biscuit, she refilled her coffee and looked at me and said, "You're not yourself." "I know," I said. She waited. "He's been coming home late a lot," I said. "I found a receipt from a jeweler. I've seen him with someone." His sister was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you talked to him?" "Not yet," she said. "Cecily, you need to talk to him before you decide what this is," I said. "I know what this is." She didn't argue with me. That Monday, I called a lawyer. Not to file anything, just to understand where I stood. The lawyer was a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and an office full of framed degrees. She walked me through what separation looks like in Ontario. Equalization of net family property. Spousal support if applicable. The matrimonial home. I took notes. "Are you certain something is happening?" she asked. "I'm certain I need to know where I stand," I said. She nodded. "That's always the right instinct." I went back to work. I did my job. I walked the dog. I made dinner 3 nights a week. I started keeping a note on my phone of dates and times, what he told me he was doing, what I actually knew. In March, we had dinner at my parents' place in Scarborough. My father made his lamb. We sat around the table and talked about normal things, and at some point my husband excused himself to take a call, and he was outside on the back porch for 20 minutes. When he came back in, my mother caught my eye across the table. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, in the way that mothers look at you when they already know, and they're waiting for you to know too. After dinner, she found me in the kitchen while my father was showing my husband something in the garage. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. I said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "Cecily, I rinsed a dish. Since November maybe longer." She put her hand on my arm. "Is there someone else?" "I think so," I said. "I haven't been able to prove it, but I think so." She said, "What do you need?" I told her I didn't know yet. We drove home in silence. He fell asleep in the passenger seat before we even got on the Gardiner. I drove and watched the highway lights and thought about the first year we were together, when we used to drive back from his parents' place in Oakville at midnight, and he'd stay awake the whole time with one hand on my knee. That was a long time ago. The following week, I found out the woman's name by accident. I was looking for a document on his laptop. He'd asked me to find a PDF in his downloads. He was in the shower, and I saw an email thread. I didn't read it. I saw the name at the top of the thread. I closed the laptop and found the document on his desk instead. Her name was Rosalind Vane. I didn't have to look her up to know who she was. The Vane name appears on the donor wall at the hospital my firm had done a renovation for. Old money. Her husband had died 2 years ago. The pieces were already there. I just finally let myself look at them. That Saturday, we were at a friend's dinner party. Couples we'd known since university. And someone made a toast to long marriages, and my husband reached over and squeezed my hand, and I let him. Because what else do you do? On the way home he said it had been a good night. I agreed. He said we should host next time. I said sure. When we got home, I went to bed before him. I lay in the dark and thought about how it's possible to share a life with someone for 7 years and reach a point where you are completely alone in a room with them. The next morning, I told him I knew about Rosalind Vane. He had just poured his coffee. He didn't drop the cup. He set it down very carefully, which was almost worse. I said I'd seen them together twice. I said I'd found the jeweler's receipt. I said I wasn't going to perform confusion I didn't have. He stood at the counter with his hands around his coffee cup and he said, "It's not what you think," I said. "Tell me what it is then." He said she was a client. An important one. She had significant capital to invest in a major condo development near the waterfront, the kind of project that would change his career. Her husband had been sick for years before he died and she'd been isolated and she needed, he used the word support. She needed support through the process, I said. Does supporting her require a $4,300 piece of custom jewelry? He was quiet. I said, does it require lying about where you are? Does it require a completely different version of every evening in the past 3 months? He said. Cecily, I can explain this. I said, I know you can. You're very good at explaining things. That's literally your job. He flinched. Good. I had not cried. I didn't cry then either. I felt like something that had been coiled very tightly inside me for months had gone completely still, like it was finished coiling. Like it had reached the end of itself and just stopped. I picked up my bag and my keys, and I took Biscuit and I went to my parents' house. My mother made tea without asking. My father took the dog into the backyard. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten 1,000 meals, and I told my mother everything. And she held my hand, and she said, "You're going to be okay," I said. I know. I wasn't entirely sure I believed it yet. But I said it anyway, because sometimes you say things ahead of the feeling. I stayed at my parents' for 9 days. During that time he called me every day. I answered twice. The first time he said he'd ended it. He said it had gone further than it should have, but not as far as I thought. I said I wasn't interested in a taxonomy of how far it had gone. The second time, he asked if I would consider counseling. I said I'd think about it. On the 9th day, my mother came into the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed and told me something I didn't know. She told me that Rosalind Vane's late husband had been a business contact of my father's. Years ago. Before the Vanes had made most of their money. She said, there had been a deal that went badly. She said my father had come very close to losing his business over it, and that the Vane family had not been particularly kind about how it resolved. She said, I recognized the name the moment you said it. I said, why didn't you tell me? She looked at the window. Because I didn't want it to be relevant. I sat with that for a moment. Did you know he was working with her? Before all this? She shook her head. I knew the name, I didn't know about him. But she had known the name for months, since before November. She had heard me mention his work, the waterfront development, and she had said, nothing. I looked at my mother, who I trusted more than almost anyone, and I tried to understand what she had and hadn't done. I said, did you say anything to him? When you realized, she said, I said something to your father. My father, it turned out, had called my husband privately in December and warned him to be careful with the Vane account, not about Rosalind herself, about the family's history. My husband had thanked him and said he had it handled, so my father knew there was something to handle and said nothing to me. I got in my car and I drove to the parking lot of a mall and I sat there for a long time. I didn't cry in my parents' kitchen. I cried in that parking lot. Not about my husband and not about Rosalind Vane, about the specific loneliness of being protected by the people who love you. And finding out that protection left a hole right where you needed to stand. I went back to the house the following week, not because I'd forgiven him. Not because I'd decided anything. Because it was my house too, and I had stopped wanting to be anywhere other than my own space. He had cleaned the whole house while I was gone. Every surface. The dog's bed was washed. There were flowers on the kitchen table. Not roses, just white tulips, which he knew I liked better. I said, "I'm not here because we're okay," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm here because I need time and I need to think. And I'm not doing that from a guest room." He said, "Whatever you need." We moved around each other in the house for 2 weeks like people in a library. Quiet, careful, aware of each other's presence without making it intrusive. He cooked dinner on the nights I worked late. I walked the dog in the mornings. We were exquisitely polite. I met with the lawyer again. We talked about what the next steps could look like if I decided to go that direction. She asked if I'd considered the implications for the matrimonial home. I had. I also, during that time, looked up Rosalind Vane. Not obsessively. I just wanted to understand what I was dealing with. She had a LinkedIn profile that listed her as chair of her family's foundation. Her husband had died 26 months ago. There were articles about charity galas, donations to the arts, a scholarship fund. She looked, in photographs, exactly as she'd looked on King Street in November. Composed, elegant. A woman who had the specific confidence that comes from never having had to worry about money. I did not contact her. The thought crossed my mind and I let it pass. What I did instead was write down everything I knew. Not for the lawyer, not for anyone. Just for myself. The dates, the receipts, the cover stories, the small inconsistencies. I wrote it all down in a notebook with a green cover. And I read it back to myself twice. And then, I put the notebook in the drawer of my nightstand. My husband found the notebook 3 days later. He didn't open it. He left it on top of the nightstand with a sticky note that said, "I saw this fell off the side. Didn't read it." I almost laughed. I still don't know if I believe he didn't read it. At the end of April, something shifted. He came home one Tuesday evening, and his face was different. Not guilty different, not tender different. Worried different. He sat down at the kitchen table and he said, "I need to tell you something." I sat across from him and waited. He said, "The Vane waterfront deal had collapsed. Not because of us. Not because of anything personal. Rosalind had decided to move her capital to a development group in Vancouver. The whole thing was dead. He was going to have to explain it to his firm." I said, "When did you find out?" "This afternoon," he said. I looked at him. "Is this the part where you tell me it was all worth it for nothing?" He said, "I'm not saying that." I said, "What are you saying?" He said, "I'm saying I have to live with what I did, regardless of whether the deal came through. And I'm saying, I don't know if you're going to stay, and I understand if you don't. But I need to tell you that I'm not going to pretend any of this didn't happen, and I'm not going to ask you to either." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in months. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Biscuit came and put his head in my lap. I called my mother. I told her what he'd said. She was quiet. Then she said, "Your father wants to talk to you." My father got on the phone. He has never been good at apologies. He is an old school man from a generation that showed up and provided and considered that sufficient. He said, "I should have told you what I knew. I was trying to handle it without making it worse. I made it worse." I said, "Yeah, Dad, you did." He was quiet. Then he said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "I need you to let me make my own decisions about my own life. That's what I need." He said, "Okay." We hung up. I sat on the bed. The evening light came through the curtains and made a stripe across the floor. And Biscuit sighed the way dogs do when they've decided everything is probably going to be fine. I think about the woman. I was in November, standing in Tim Hortons watching my husband through a window. I was so careful not to jump to conclusions. I was so patient with myself about what I was and wasn't seeing. I extended every possible benefit of every possible doubt. I protected his version of events before he even offered one. I don't regret that. Exactly. I think I needed to be sure before I was willing to blow up everything. But I also think that sometimes we protect people long past the point when the evidence has stopped being ambiguous, and we call it fairness, when really it's just fear. We went to counseling. We went for 3 months. The counselor was a quiet man with an office in the annex who had clearly heard every version of every story and had no interest in taking sides. He asked good questions and let the silence sit after them, and some weeks it was genuinely useful, and some weeks I drove home feeling like we'd just paid $90 to confirm that we were two people who had hurt each other. In September, I went to visit a friend in Ottawa for a long weekend. I drove because I like driving. I took the 401 with the windows cracked and a playlist I'd made in my early 20s, and I didn't think about any of it for 6 hours. When I got there, my friend poured wine and we sat on her back porch, and she asked me what I was going to do. I said I didn't know yet. She said, "That's okay. You don't have to know yet." I said, "I know I don't have to. I just feel like I should." She laughed. "That's very you." She was right. I have always felt like I should know things before I'm ready to know them. I have always put more pressure on myself to have arrived at the right conclusion than I put on anyone else to deserve it. I drove home on the Sunday. He had made dinner. Biscuit was ecstatic to see me in that way that dogs are, completely and without condition. I stood in my kitchen and I thought, I am not the same person I was in November. I'm not sure yet if I'm someone who stays or someone who goes, but I am not the person who stood in Tim Hortons looking through a window pretending not to understand what she saw. Whatever I decide, I'll be the one deciding. Not him, not my parents, not the version of me who was too careful for too long. That feels like something. Not an ending, exactly. More like the first sentence of whatever comes next.